will we know if artificial intelligence or AI is becoming conscious? That remarkable question is being increasingly asked by many in the AI community, even as there are as many who say so far AI with a measure of sentience is an exaggerated notion. Nevertheless, it's being felt that the world needs to be prepared for the eventuality that AI could develop human like consciousness and decide how to deal with it. Neuroscientist Anil Seth, professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience at the University of Sussex, as well as director of the Sussex Centre for Consciousness Science, has been tracking the AI and consciousness debate closely. He has called for more precise and well tested theories of consciousness before we think in terms of attributing any kind of human like sentience to AI. Professor Seth, who is the Sunday Times best-selling author of Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, spoke to Mayank Chhaya Reports about AI and consciousness. Welcome to Mayank Chhaya Reports, Professor Seth. It's a great pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I was reading parts of your book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, and a couple of things jumped out at me. You talk about surgery that you underwent and you were under general anesthesia. I had two, in fact. One was a colon resection, the other was a quadruple bypass. And I know exactly what you mean. Basically, that period just disappears from your life. You cease to exist. And in that context, you say something quite remarkable. You say general anesthesia doesn't just work on your brain or mind, it works on your consciousness. Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, I think that's why anesthetics are so useful, right? I mean, they wouldn't be that great if they just made you forget about conscious pain that you experienced during the operation, or did something else that didn't change your experience in the moment. The whole marvel of anesthesia is that it takes away experience itself. Now, for me, it was one of these things that made it just very, very clear that consciousness, that this fact of that we all share, that we have subjective experiences. Now, this is something that is amenable to scientific study because we can manipulate it. Anesthetics manipulate consciousness. They turn it off and they turn it back on again. And of course, that's the other miracle about anesthetics. They can turn consciousness back on. There would not be very much use if they didn't work on the other side as well.
What was your experience coming out? Mine was very bizarre in the first one, very bizarre visuals. Apart from you talk nonsense, delirious stuff, what was your experience?
Yeah, pretty similar. I mean, I've had several 3 or 4 general anesthesias now, and I think the most recent one, and the one that led me to write about it in the book, was a relatively minor operation. So by this time, I was not so much worried about the surgery, and I was really trying to pay attention to the experience of anesthesia, or the non-experience of anesthesia. And it's two things struck me. Firstly, on the way in, on the way under, it's really quick. It's so quick. You try to count and you're just out, and then you're back. And could have been any amount of time that would have passed. It could have been 5 minutes. It could have been 5 hours. Could have been 5 years. It's just time is joined up at either side. And when I was coming around, then it's a bit more. It takes much longer. Of course, there are other drugs you often have as well as the anesthesia, that might contribute to the delirium, the weird kinds of hallucinations, the feeling of not being really sure where you are. I think the one thing that I really remember at one of the occasions was that I think about 3 hours after the operation, I was in another room entirely, and I suddenly noticed that my legs had been sort of covered with these plastic tubes to do something about blood flow. And to me, this was again remarkable. It was like, how did this happen without me noticing? It just really, again, of course, they'd done a whole bunch of other stuff too. But the fact that, so many things could have happened without me noticing, again, underlined how deeply changed we are from any normal state, including sleep, including deep sleep. Another way I think I put it in the book is that it really turns us into objects and then back again into people. And that's just really stayed with me as something that's both practically very, very useful, but existentially and philosophically and neuroscientifically incredibly fascinating.
But if consciousness is something so intangible, indefinable, even ephemeral, and when you say general anesthesia essentially suspends that, what do you think it suspends?
Well, I don't think it is ephemeral or undefinable. I think it's difficult to define. It's consciousness has been a challenge not just for neuroscience, but for philosophy, for religion, even for any school of thinking. But there's we can make a lot of progress with it. So I think there's a broad consensus definition of consciousness is the presence of any kind of subjective experience whatsoever. This means it's not the same as intelligence. It's not the same as self-awareness. It's not the same as mere sensitivity to something in the environment. That it feels like something to be conscious of the world and of being a self within that world. So when we're studying consciousness, that's what we're studying. We're studying the phenomenological, the subjective aspects of brain and body states.
Before we get into the question of artificial intelligence and consciousness, let's start with human consciousness, more specifically what you call the neuronal wetware inside our heads. What's that and why wet?
Well, if we want to understand consciousness, probably the best place to start is with systems where we know or are very, very sure that consciousness exists. This is human beings and some other animals too. I think probably lots of other animals, but let's say primates, mammals, these kinds of things. And of course, we start by examining how the brain works with respect to consciousness. And it's probably the oldest observation in neuroscience that consciousness is very intimately related to brain structure and dynamics. And so this is where the neuroscience of consciousness starts. And I use the term wetware here when talking about the brain, I think, just to emphasize that the metaphors that we often use when we talk about the brain can be very useful, but they can also be misleading. And one of the most powerful metaphors over the last decades has been that the brain is some kind of computer and that it performs information processing, that the mind is some sort of software running on the brain's hardware, or the mindware running on the brain's wetware. And so I prefer to use wetware just to emphasize that it's not the same thing as hardware. In fact, there is no sharp distinction in the brain between the mind and its physical substrate, as we find in a typical computer between the software that it runs and the hardware that it runs on. Every time two neurons fire, the structure of the brain changes. And there's many, many different levels on which we can think about brain structure and dynamics from even within individual neurons. A single neuron is a highly complicated biological machine. And of course, we've got over 80 billion of them and 1,000 times more connections. So I think we often can give ourselves either a false sense of understanding or put false constraints on what we think can be understood if we use metaphors which can take us so far but no further.
Brains, as you point out again in your book, are both chemical machines as well as electrical networks. And once again, they have always existed within a body. That is a fundamental and defining difference between humans and any AI-propelled human-like system, is it not?
Well, there are some AI systems that are embodied, that we have robotics as well. I think robotics has not enjoyed quite the limelight that other aspects of AI has enjoyed lately. But yeah, you're right. In the main, brains of human beings, of any other animal, are fundamentally embodied organs. They evolved, they develop in order to keep the body alive. And the body here is not just an object that's there to perform functions, to move around. The body is a complex biological system itself. And a large part of what the brain does is sense and regulate the body from within. It senses the blood pressure, heart rate, all these kinds of things, blood oxygenation, controls and regulates our internal physiology. This is very, very different from AI systems, which typically take in some input and generate some output. And even if they're embodied, it's typically the body is not something that the AI system is actively maintaining. It's something that the AI system might be controlling.
Since AI is not a consequence of any comparable biological or chemical processes or electrical exchanges, even of the kind that we have, why would it have the potential to develop human-like consciousness?
Well, this is a very good question. And I'm not sure that it does, at least along the trajectory that it's currently developing. And one of the things that's been somewhat noticeable is that this assumption that as AI develops, that at some point the lights come on and it's not only intelligent, but also conscious. And I think this idea is poorly supported. And I think I know where it comes from. We humans, we tend to be quite exceptionalist in the sense that we think we're special, right? We think we're special in all of creation, and we like to put things together that we think define this specialness. So we know we're conscious and we think that's special. We also think we're intelligent, and to some extent we are, though I think we can argue about how that's going in the world. But there's this tendency to therefore associate consciousness with intelligence because they go together in us in a particular way. And I think that's just a very poorly justified assumption. Intelligence gives us some ways of being conscious with different forms of cognition. I can have different kinds of conscious experiences. But the most basic forms of conscious experience that are probably shared by many other animals that don't reach our human, or at least what we think of as advanced human levels of intelligence. There are experiences like thirst, hunger, pain, pleasure. You don't have to have too much cognitive sophistication for these to be useful conscious experiences to have. So just by making machines smarter doesn't mean that they'll inevitably become conscious. Can't entirely rule it out, because one of the issues here is that one of the reasons why working in the neuroscience of consciousness is really exciting is that there is yet no consensus agreement about the minimal sufficient conditions for a system to be conscious. It could be that it just happens by accident, but the idea that it's guaranteed to happen just in virtue of things becoming smarter, I think that's definitely wrong.
As you point out, consciousness is about experience, right? We feel self inside. How do we know if an AI system is feeling it? The presumption is based on what?
Yeah, this is a really tough one to ask, because the kinds of tests, the kind of criteria that we might apply are going to be very different for an AI system than for, let's say, other ambiguous cases where we're not sure whether something is conscious or not. Take like a newborn human infant, or a non-human animal, or somebody after major brain damage, or even sort of a new form of neurotechnology like a brain organoid, which is a bunch of neurons in a dish. What kinds of tests can we apply? Now, for humans, the kind of gold standard is to ask them. We ask for some verbal report. Are you conscious? Can you hear me? Back to anesthesia thing. Can you hear me yet? Are you there?
Yeah.
And if we say, yeah, I can hear you, then that's pretty good evidence that the person is conscious, because we have a whole evolutionary history of not being able to do that when unconscious. But of course, this doesn't work for AI. It specifically doesn't work for large language models, or these, chat bots that are based on large language models. We cannot, because they are designed to utter fluent responses to our input. So we need some other way of developing our credence in whether AI is conscious or not. And for me, and I think for a number of others working and thinking in this area now, the best way to do that is to take our existing scientific theories of consciousness and see what each says about what it would take for an artificial system to be conscious. And then we can begin to talk a little bit more precisely about this. We can think how confident we are in a given theory, how confident we are that it applies to the AI system in question, which of the conditions does this AI system display, and then we can get at least, we can do better than just saying nothing at all. Now, I don't think we don't yet have a fully reliable consciousness meter that we can point at the next iteration of ChatGPT or whatever it might be. But we can also say more than nothing. And what we need to do is just iterate that process and be also very mindful of the fact that because we are very, very susceptible to projecting qualities like consciousness into things, we might be very easily misled if we go on our kind of just gut intuition. Again, we've seen this with language models. There was the case of the Google engineer last year, Blake Lemoine, who thought that Lambda, this Google chatbot, was sentient. And this, I think, just underlines how if we rely on indicators that would mean something in a human being, if we rely on those indicators, we can be massively misled in other systems.
Right. Presuming that AI becomes as seemingly sentient as us, would it still not be a wholly parallel kind of intelligence that's merely soaked up every piece of information that we humans created?
Well, now we're moving into an interesting kind of speculation, right? The range of other types of conscious minds.
Right.
When we think about what it's like to be a human being, and we're all different anyway. I mean, there's no single way of being conscious, even for humans. When we look at other animals, I spent some time with octopuses during my career over the last few years, and their way of being in the world is likely to be entirely different from a human being's. And so if it is possible to generate an AI system that has subjective experience, it might have, and it's likely to have, an entirely different, a very, very different kind of conscious experience. And this could be, I think this is really important to underline, because when we're thinking about the risks and the benefits of conscious AI, we don't want to assume that conscious AI will be like human AI. It may be very, very different. So, for instance, human consciousness is very tied up with emotion, with motivation, with agency, and with experiences of volition, free will, these kinds of things. Now, it may be that it's possible to have consciousness without any of these things. Now, I personally don't think entirely. I think consciousness for me is something that is fundamentally tied to our nature as living creatures and is probably bound up with emotion at some unavoidable level. But I might be wrong about this. But some of these other aspects of consciousness as it emerges in humans may very well be completely optional in some future conscious machine, whatever that might look like. And we face some design choices about that, and we also face some ethical dilemmas about that too, because a lot of people talk about the risks to humans of developing conscious AI, which usually, I think, arise from Terminator style misunderstandings of what's going on here, that as soon as AI develops consciousness, it will want to take over the world and all that. I mean, that's just, I don't think that's a particularly useful way of thinking. But from the other side, of course, if something is conscious, then we have a moral and ethical obligation towards it too, and we mustn't neglect that side of the equation.
Aren't we too susceptible to anthropomorphizing machines? We even anthropomorphize the so-called aliens. We see them in our image.
Yeah.
Isn't that a problem?
Yeah, it is. I mean, as we were saying, the Google engineer last year, and it's very difficult to avoid doing this. It's the way our minds naturally work, to projecting qualities into other things. I mean, we do it with each other too. We project understanding into other people's minds where it may not exist sometimes, or may exist differently. But we definitely do it to non-human systems as well. I mean, we do it all the time to non-human animals. Those of us who have pets, we're always projecting things into the minds of our pets that may well not be there, and we do it more generally. And so I think it's really, this becomes almost a sociological question. I mean, what are the cues that cause us to make these anthropomorphic projections? And language is a big one, which is why language models have been so interesting, but also disruptive here. Because when something communicates with us, even if it's in a disembodied way, just by exchanging text, even if it makes horrendous errors and confabulates all the time, it's quite difficult to resist the temptation to project qualities into that system. And that itself is very disruptive. You know, if we believe that something is conscious, or if we can't help feeling that something is conscious, even though we know it isn't, you know, that I think opens us to making assumptions about how it might behave, what it might do, that might be very wrong, because it would be what we would do because we are conscious. And if this thing isn't, or is conscious different ways, it's no guarantee is going to do that.
To me, I mean, I'm speculating here. To me, so far, it seems that the best AI may be able to do is mimic human consciousness in a way that is indistinguishable for us when we look at it. Do you think that might happen?
I think that's very likely to happen in limited domains, right? So I think, you know, right now in the language domain, it's already getting pretty close. Language models are improving a lot. They're still quite easy to catch out if you try to catch them out, but perhaps these things will get ironed out. And we may well live in a situation relatively soon where we will simply not be able to tell whether we're interacting with a non-conscious large language model or with a conscious human on the other side. Or relatedly, we may not be able to resist attributing consciousness to a large language model, even though we know it's not a human, even though we know or have good reason to believe that it isn't really conscious. In the same way, there are some visual illusions that even when you know what's going on, like two lines may look the same length but might be different lengths. You know, even when you know what's going on, you can't help see it in a particular way. And I think we may well enter that kind of world very soon, and that will be problematic.
Yeah.
You know, it's going to be problematic, as we said, in terms of our predictions about what these things do, but also ethically, because we may well then start caring about these systems when our time and moral and ethical reserves might be better put to caring about other people or other non-human animals. And on the flip side, if we learn to not expend any kind of ethical resources on these things, we are in the danger of brutalizing our minds. I mean, Immanuel Kant had this nice way of putting this. It's a kind of, it's why we don't, you know, destroy plastic dolls in front of children. I mean, we know they're just dolls, but that it's something psychologically unhealthy to treat things that, you know, that might seem conscious in ways that we wouldn't treat them if they really, really were. So there's a lot to be confronted here, because while actually conscious AI is either impossible or very far away, or we just don't know, you know, this world of conscious seeming AI in limited domains, I think, is really quite close.
Remarkable. You know, to go off slightly off a tangent, in the Indian, rather Hindu civilizational context, where even the most inanimate is often seen as something which has some kind of life, be it a tree, be it a piece of rock. From that standpoint, I'm beginning to think that of all the civilizations which would take to AI as having consciousness easily, perhaps it could be the Indian civilization, because they see it everywhere, right?
Well, that, maybe also because, I mean, Hinduism, my family's half Indian, and there's something delightfully pantheistic about Hinduism as well. So, you know, hey, you have a new thing, you just incorporate it as part of the pantheon of Hindu deities. So you might be right. There's another aspect, though, to like a Hindu perspective on the world, or an Indian in general perspective on the world, which I think is interesting here, which is about the soul. And in the Western tradition, broadly associated with Descartes, but of course many more philosophers, we tend to think of the defining element of the human mind and a human conscious mind as this immaterial, rational agency. And this is really, it's this idea that you can think of, that's the heart of, that's the frame in which AI has been developed in the West. This development of something that's rational and disembodiable and could run on anything, could be uploaded to the cloud and so on. That's the image in which AI is being generated, even though it may not be explicitly put that way. And in Hinduism, the soul, as you will know, is not the kind of disembodied rational agent. It's much more, at least in my understanding, much more associated with the body and with breath. This notion of Atman.
Right.
There is, of course, still the idea that you can sort of skip from one person to another, but of transubstantiation. But this idea that soul and breath are closer together than, say, like soul and rational intelligence. I think that's really important, and for me, that fits much more comfortably with what I think consciousness really depends on, which is the body, the flesh and blood mechanisms that we're made of, the wetware, the raw biological materiality of us. Because there's just a big open question here that computers, however sophisticated they are, however many GPUs we have running, are we just simulating something, or are we actually instantiating that thing?
Right.
And this gets back to your question. And there are some things for which the distinction doesn't really apply, right? We have computers that play chess. They play chess. That's what they do. And you can argue they play the history of chess or whatever, but no, they play chess. That's fine. But there are other things for which a simulation is just always going to be a simulation. And I think here of things like big weather forecasting simulations. You can make them as accurate as you like, as detailed as you like, but it never gets actually wet or windy inside any of these computers running a detailed weather forecast.
Right.
So this is the question, like, is consciousness more like playing chess, or is it more like the weather?
In your book, you make a striking observation. Consciousness has more to do with being alive than being intelligent. Elaborate.
Yeah, I think this is kind of what I've been getting to. So on the one hand, we have this fairly Western inspired perspective of human exceptionalism, that consciousness and intelligence go together, and when we try to create systems in our own image, we try to build artificial intelligences, we therefore think that consciousness is going to come along for the ride because we make this association. I just think that's wrong. Consciousness is not the same as intelligence. And also, the idea that consciousness is something that could be implemented inside a computer is a massive assumption. Now, I don't know whether it's right or wrong. I suspect that it's wrong, but I'm in a minority here. Most neuroscientists would probably say consciousness is something that could be implemented in a different system made out of different kinds of things. But the more that I've been thinking about it, the more I try to understand every form of consciousness as a kind of perceptual experience, whether it's of the world or of the self. And every perceptual experience, I think, can be understood as a form of prediction the brain is making about something. And all of these predictions, for me, are ultimately grounded in regulating the living body, in keeping us alive. Descartes had this phrase called the beast machine, and he used that to basically, with respect to non-human animals, to kind of make the point that they weren't conscious. They didn't have the kinds of conscious rational minds that we did, that humans did. So he called them, they're just beast machines. The fact that they might yelp if you kick them or bleed when you cut them doesn't really matter. And I've come to think almost entirely the opposite, that what might endow us with consciousness is the fact that we are beast machines, that everything we experience arises with, through, and because of our living bodies. And to the extent that this is on the right track, conscious AI becomes even further away, because before you have conscious AI, you would first need living AI, and that's not the route that people are taking, at least not most people.
I want to broaden a little bit to philosophical areas. How do you view Gotham Bulls' non-self doctrine, which broadly argues that there is no permanent self? Underlying that idea is one of momentariness, which is kshanikavad, as it's known as. Kshanika being moment.
Okay.
It's an extraordinary conception 2,500 years ago, that it is moment to moment to moment.
Yeah.
What lies in between those two moments? Perhaps nothingness. That's the idea. How do you look at an explanation of that kind?
So I think there's a lot to it, and it's, of course, there's many traditions, Buddhism as well. Many Buddhist traditions think of the self as a process rather than an essence or an entity. Even in Western philosophy, David Hume talked about the self as a bundle of perceptions. I think the key thing here is to understand that the self is not the thing that does the perceiving of the world and that is exercising free will and making decisions. All of these things arise in consciousness. Experiences of agency, experiences of self, experiences of the world, experiences of the body. All of these arise within consciousness. And I think are different forms of perception. And indeed, this then means that there is an impermanence to the self. There is a continuous change of the experience of being a self. And it's something that is quite hard to recognize, because it doesn't always seem like that to us. And I think this is why practices like meditation can be quite useful, because they can draw our attention to the nature of the self. If we look for it, if we look for the self, where is it? Where is it? It doesn't seem to be anywhere. And of course, there's a clue in that when we try to do that and repeatedly fail to identify the thing that is the self. So I at least in theory am very much aligned with that idea. In practice, of course, for me, most of the time, it still feels like there is a self, and it's more or less the same self, and it is more or less the same. And these changes, they happen, but just like change blindness in our experience of the world, if something changes slowly and we're not expecting it to change, then we don't perceive the change. And I think we have a kind of self-change blindness where the experience of being who we are is always changing. But most of the time, we never experience the change itself.
Yeah. Life as a series of moments, always transmigrating, is an astounding concept. Now, look at this particular quote from Buddha. In place of an individual, there exists a succession of instants of consciousness. Yeah. It's poetic, profound, and purely cerebral.
Yeah, and I think that's, I like that. So it does raise an open question, though, whether there are instants or whether it's a dynamic. Whether consciousness arises in frames like in a movie, or whether there's something intrinsically dynamic to it. I think that's a fascinating, but it's a slightly different question. Right. I think zooming out from that, the idea that all there is moment to moment are conscious experiences. Not a separate self and world, not the self having a conscious experience of the world, but the self is part of that conscious experience too. I think from that perspective, a lot of the philosophical confusion about consciousness can dissolve. Things like free will can be understood, I think, much more simply as experiences rather than as causes without cause, as often people like to try to preserve a sense of free will as something that can change the course of physical events in the world. If we think of it as a form of perception, a form of experience, then it becomes much easier to accommodate within kind of a naturalistic worldview.
The reason I'm citing this seemingly esoteric ideas is, I mean, these are all products of a very conscious mind, namely that of Gotham Bulls. I seriously wonder whether an AI system has the capacity to produce something like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're only just beginning to figure out how to interpret things that AI can produce. One of my mentors, Daniel Dennett, is well known for saying that we should always remember that when we create AI, we're creating tools and not colleagues. And sure, we can use language models to generate things that can be prompts for our own creativity, and that can be very, very useful. But what meaning we attribute to that is going to be very different. So it's a little, I guess it's a little bit like, the old story about monkeys bashing away on typewriters, and if you leave them long enough, they'll come up with the works of Shakespeare, right? So I think now what we've got is something similar, but it's not just monkeys and type. We've got something much more, much better designed, not just sort of some random key pressing stuff going on. So the space of things that will come out is much less random. It's much more interesting. It's potentially much more useful. But the meaning in these things still comes from us rather than the systems themselves.
There is an interesting history of science fiction writers presaging things which are already in place now. One point being HAL in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Yeah, which was, it was a conscious system in many ways, right? If there is a trend in that, do you think we may end up with what HL was?
Well, I think what science fiction does a great job of is being very prescient about some of the dilemmas and some of the mistakes that we might make. So in 2001, HAL 9000. Certainly we're encouraged to believe that it's a conscious system, and in there it's also kind of disembodied, although the whole ship is its body in some way. The thing that I remember from that film that stayed with me is the reliance of individuality on memory. And there's this scene where Dave Bowman removes the memory banks, and it starts to, his personality begins to disintegrate. It's an incredibly moving scene. I still find, and I think that's prescient in how we might interact with large language model based systems. That if they, again, we're going to project identity into them, and if they start to exhibit memories, then that's going to play on our own anthropomorphic tendencies in some ways. And I think often AI is so another film I think that's very prescient is classic film Blade Runner. Right. Now, in Blade Runner, instead of this Turing test, which is this test of whether you can tell the difference between a machine and a computer based on disembodied language exchanges. So arguably, language models pass or are close to passing the Turing test. Right. But in the Blade Runner, you have this thing called the Voight-Kampff test, which is all about emotional response. And that's what really matters. That's what marks the difference between a human being and a replicant in those films. Right. And I think that's beautifully prescient about the importance of the body and our nature as living creatures for real consciousness. And I think so that may come to the fore. So you're right, there has been I think it's both, it's a very productive interaction in some ways, but I also think there's a bit of a tendency for the dramatic elements of AI to get overemphasized in our projections about real AI. And this is the Terminator type thing. We tend to fixate on those things which are not I guess not the cinematic philosophical thought experiment, but the more dramatic big narrative. And those aspects of the films can, I think, sometimes lead us astray in making projections about future AI scenarios.
To conclude, the specific question of people in California creating sort of guidelines in the event AI becomes conscious, and they seem to think that it's not that far. What is your take on that? Do you think it's premature, or you think it's good to create those guidelines?
I think it's certain. Yeah, I do think it's good to create guidelines. I'm not sure what would be the specific guidelines, but I certainly think a few things are really important right now. Firstly, there's this attitude still prevalent in some parts of the tech sector, which is this, build it, let's build it first and worry about the consequences later. And we've seen how damaging this can be in tech already, in things like
Right.
social media. And so this idea that, wouldn't it be great to build a conscious AI? Let's just do it. I think that is not to be encouraged. And I think, we should make it very clear that that is a bad thing to do. The problem is, of course, we don't know what it would take. So we don't know exactly how to dissuade it from, while still being able to pursue AI research. Because, of course, AI has huge potential to benefit humanity and the planet and society. So it's difficult to know exactly where the specific guidelines, but we should change this sort of attitude of just, yes, it'd be great to have a conscious machine. No, it would not be great. It would be very problematic to have that.
Yeah.
So, but there may be things we can, maybe guidelines we can establish which make real conscious AI less likely, but also, and I think equally or also important, is to make sure that we build systems which are going to minimize risks even when they just simulate consciousness, because there's a lot of problems that will arise, as we've discussed, for systems that just give the appearance of being conscious. And so we need to make sure that we develop systems being mindful of those risks. And this may mean, for instance, developing systems that, instead of trying to persuade us that they're conscious, make it clear that they aren't in some way.
Right.
Or don't use emotional words in some way, or don't use agency type phrases in some ways. So I think there are many things we can do. I think the other really important general principle here is that research in AI needs to be increasingly coupled with research into consciousness and neuroscience more generally, because we are still flying a little bit blind in this area. There are a number of different theories about the biological basis of consciousness. They all make different claims about what the necessary and sufficient conditions would be for consciousness in non-biological systems. Mine is pretty, it's a bit of an outlier, because it suggests, as we've said, that consciousness is not something that will arise just in a simulation. It has to be the hardware, the wetware really matters. Most other theories don't make that assumption. So I think iterating and AI research together with consciousness science is absolutely key. Not gunning to build conscious machines just because they're cool is really key, and figuring out the risks and ways to avert them for systems that merely seem to be conscious, I think, is also key.
Sometimes I get the sense that there's almost a race to create a new species. And that, as you said, it could be deeply problematic. On that note, Professor Seth, it was absolutely riveting for me to talk to you. I hope you thought it was worth your while.